Hello, everyone, and welcome to Automated Quoting at HARBEC. My name is Matthew Hinshaw, and I am a technical consultant here at aPriori. I am joined by Keith Schneider, who is a sales engineer at HARBEC. Before we begin, I want to go through a couple housekeeping notes. The attendee lines will be on mute throughout the session. We will be taking questions throughout the presentation, but it will be utilizing the chat panel on the event website, not the Zoom chat. Please enter any questions you have on the costinsight.com chat panel. We will try to answer as many questions throughout the session and at the end of the session as possible. You can also feel free to schedule a meeting with me via the meeting scheduler on the event website. So if you go to the event website, near the chat panel, choose People, select my name, Matthew Hinshaw, and schedule a meeting with me. Alternatively, you can contact me via email, and I will be sharing my email and Keith's email at the end of the session. We have also uploaded a PDF of today's presentation, which you can access in the Files panel. Let's begin. So as I mentioned, we will be talking today about automated quoting at HARBEC. So we'll start with a little bit of background about who HARBEC is. We'll talk next about how aPriori came to be at HARBEC and the business challenges HARBEC was trying to address. We're going to also give some concrete examples of quoting parts in a couple different commodities, comparing HARBEC's process pre-aPriori to post-aPriori. We'll talk after that about some key results HARBEC has been able to achieve, discuss HARBEC's future plans with aPriori, and finish up with HARBEC's keys to success, both in the initial implementation and since then as they've been achieving sustained value with aPriori. Keith, can you tell me a little bit about HARBEC and your story and your capabilities?
Sure. HARBEC is a contract manufacturer. We've been in business for about 44 years. We offer CNC machining, injection molding, and 3D printing, all while using sustainable manufacturing processes that allow us to be carbon and water neutral. Our main market segments are aerospace, medical, and high-end industrial. We're AS 9100, ISO 13485, ISO 14001, ISO 50001, and ITAR certified. Currently, we have 39 CNCs ranging from 3 to 7 axis, 30 injection molding machines from 55 to 560 tons, and 12 3D printers for both metal and plastics. We're a company that has a strong focus on speed and quality, so aPriori was a good fit to allow us to expedite our quoting process.
Keith, that's great. As you mentioned, there's a number of different capabilities and machines that HARBEC has. Could you talk a little bit about late 2019, early 2020, the kinds of challenges you were facing quoting across all of those commodities and processes?
Sure. A big one for us was time to quote. As industry kind of changes, speed is a big portion of that. So we typically, our quoting times were industry standard, but we were looking to do better. And we have a limited number of people that are able to quote all of the processes that we have in-house. So we needed to find a way that we could utilize those folks best. And, a software program definitely helps, especially if it can decrease that time that is required to quote. And another thing we dealt with a lot of was the variability of quoting between different folks. So different quoters would quote things a little bit differently. And, we're really trying to hone in our business to single-digit percentage points. And when you have variability in the quoting stage between individual quoters, it's really difficult to do that.
Absolutely. So then could you walk me through a little bit what happened with aPriori? So you've engaged with aPriori, you started off on the implementation. What was your path to start to be able to use aPriori in your business and really get some value out of it within the quoting framework?
Yeah, so we picked kind of our biggest departments first. We went with our CNC machining department and our injection molding department first. Worked with a number of people at aPriori, really customized things, and it made it so that it really was representative of our business, our machines, and how we quoted things. So I thought that was kind of a unique thing, that it wasn't just a program that you can buy that's kind of canned and it is meant to work just across the board. It's really customizable, and we customized it right down to every little facet of our business.
That's great. That all sounds so you were able to put your machines in there, able to cover your processes and the way you really ran your business throughout those commodities.
Right. We put all of our machines, all of the limitations of our machines, uh, even all the way down to processing required for some injection molding parts. We have all the way down to residence time in the barrels for any of you injection molders out there is programmed into our quoting software now. So we can dictate at the quoting stage what injection molding machine this part would go into. And it also allows us to do a little bit of risk analysis on the front end to see if we actually have the machine. And we may or may not have a machine that's capable of running these parts, but we were able to implement all of that into the program.
Great. So then talk to me a little bit. I see there's kind of a gap here between when you wrapped up with injection molding and then eventually got to additive. What was going on in between there? Did it take a while for you guys to get additive up and running after that?
No, it was more of finding time to be able to implement additive, to be honest. So we went live, and then HARBEC decided that we were going to attempt to go live additive ourselves. So we didn't have the aPriori implementation team on that one. So there was a little bit of a time span where we were kind of just running and verifying that everything was working great, and on the CNC machining and the injection molding side of things. And then I just had to set aside some weeks there to be able to implement additive. But once we got started on it, the software is really intuitive, even on the back end. And we were able to, get all of our data in there, do the testing. It was in a matter of a couple of weeks it was live.
Excellent. Great. So I like concrete examples. I like to be able to really talk through exactly what's going on. And I want to give some examples to make this quoting process a little bit more tangible for the folks listening in here. So we have a plastic molding part here, just up on the screen. Could you walk us through how you would quote this part prior to aPriori? What does that process look like? Some of the limitations, some of the challenges you were running into, and kind of what you were seeing there before you implemented aPriori?
So pre-aPriori, we really had one person that was doing mold quotes. So for injection molding, you need a mold first. So you need to have somebody that can kind of look at how you're going to put this into a mold, what actions are required, and then you need to cost the mold and figure out exactly what that cost is going to be as far as labor and materials. And it's a long process, in all honesty. Just to be able to quote the mold, it's not something that's trivial. It's a lot of money, and you kind of need to get it right. So it was a long process. We would bring it into our CAD system, review everything, kind of do a rough tool layout. We'd use a number of different catalogs and pricing guides to do all of the components. And once we had that mold price, we would move on to the piece pricing, where we would do a number of calculations and figure out the cycle time and figure out what tonnage press and what barrel was required. And then we would put that all into an ERP system, and it would work back all the numbers with our hourly rates and with our materials and our markups. And, it was typically 1 week would be really quick, but we were in that closer to the 2-week range, mostly on mold quotes. It's just it's a lot of work, a lot of variables. Sure. And again, we had the consistency issue between individual quoters, depending on who quoted it, how they looked at it, how they reviewed the mold. There's a number of assumptions you can make on different materials. So we had probably in all of our processes, the most variability was in the mold quote process.
That's some good insight there. So now what I have here is a little screenshot of what this looks like in aPriori, which I'm sure you're pretty familiar with at this point. What does this look like now? What is your quoting process for this kind of part? This part shows up tomorrow. What process are you going to go through at this point now that you've got aPriori set up?
Right. So a lot of the manual processes and calculations, all the calculations are gone. They're all in aPriori now. So we are able to bring a part in. We run a cost model really quick on aPriori. It tells us what kind of tool, what kind of side actions, how big the tool is going to be. It looks at all of our different machines that we have, tells us what tonnage press, what individual press it's going to run in with the barrel size to make sure that we don't have issues with residency time. It's consistent, it catches everything, and we have reduced the quote time substantially now. Our rejection molds or molded parts are 2 to 3 days. So aPriori does all of the calculations for us. There's no manual calculations at all anymore.
That's fantastic. And we were talking a little bit little bit before this, you had mentioned as well that this has also helped when you're trying to send out some of these parts to sub-suppliers as well, yes?
Right, right. So we build most of our molds in house, but we do get inundated as everyone else does, where we have to subcontract molds. So in the past, when we knew we were getting close to that point, we would reach out to sub-tier suppliers and ask for quotations on everything, and then kind of make a decision once we had the purchase order if we were going to keep it in house or give that purchase order to the sub-tier supplier. So sub-tier supplier could quote a lot of molds and maybe only get a small percentage depending on, where that workflow was when we received the purchase order. What we're doing now is we're not reaching out to them on the front end. We're using aPriori, we're quoting it, that's the number. And then if we do have to farm that out or subcontract that out, that number is close enough where we're able to directly just issue the PO to our sub-tier suppliers. And we're always within a couple of percentage points. So we're always really close. On our end, and in some cases, we've been able to negotiate with the sub-tier supplier based on the aPriori quote assumptions that were made. So sometimes they're making assumptions, and then we can look at it and go, no, actually, if you quote it this way, what do you think? And then we'll get a number back that is very close to what we needed that came out of aPriori, and then we can push that job to a subcontractor.
That's fantastic. Really across the quoting process, even as you're sending things out, you're able to keep that consistency. And it sounds like that's really a major benefit.
Yeah, and you're not inundating the sub-tier suppliers with quotations that they may or may not receive. So I think it's a win-win for everyone.
Yeah, everybody saves time on that churn there for sure. So let's take one more example. Let's talk about an additive part. So we have this bracket over here that we want to quote in additive. What would this have looked like prior to aPriori? What was your process there for quoting these additive parts?
So prior to aPriori, we would use a couple pieces of software to be able to quote an additive part. We would bring it in, we would look at the geometry, kind of figure out how we're going to orient it in the machine. And then it would go into a separate piece of software that would be a build estimator, and it would tell us roundabout time. Software took a substantial amount of time to run to build those time estimates. In some cases, it could run for 15 hours. Some cases, it was only an hour, but majority of the time was spent on that quote was just letting that software just build up that build time. And then we would put all of that information again manually into our ERP system and develop the quotation. So it was 2 to 3 days. And it was definitely a long process.
For sure. And so what did you do if I'm the customer, I want to build this part, I make some minor tweaks and I want to change the build direction? What does that look like kind of prior to aPriori?
Looks like a complete requote. So we would go through all of the same processes again, because changing the orientation of the part would impact the build time significantly.
Sure.
So we would need to rerun all of the software pieces again to generate that build time and get that quotation complete.
Gotcha. So then if we talk again about aPriori and what kind of benefit you get out of running through aPriori, what does this look like now? What are you able to do within additive if you're quoting parts today with aPriori?
Yeah, the big thing for us was we had one person available prior to aPriori to quote additive parts. So we had one person that would do all of the quotes. We have 5 users now. Whoa. They were brought up to date super quick. We had one training session. As I said, it's super intuitive. It's integrated with our ERP system, so they are able to do quotes now amazingly fast. Usually in an hour or less. Once they have all of the data, they can turn it around and spit out a quote really quickly. And we just have a wide variety of people that are able to use it now in the additive world because it is so intuitive. It picks up the build direction almost always. You can change it manually, but I'm going to say 99% of the time it picks the correct build orientation for you. Great. So it eliminates a lot of that expertise that you needed for supports and build orientations. These guys can drop it right in there, and basically it just spits out the number. They have some boxes they select for different materials and different processes for the different machines that we have, and it gives them a quote really quickly.
That sounds great. It sounds like really a major improvement there. And as you mentioned, if I if I'm the customer and I want another build direction or I want a little bit of an adjustment, it sounds like this is really pretty quick to be able to make that tweak, send it
Yeah.
right back to them.
Yeah, it's a matter of minutes now. And the other thing to mention is the build time estimator that we were previously using that was from the manufacturers of the machine was very slow. But we're the build time estimator here, or the whole cost estimator, I should say, in aPriori, runs even on a horribly long part, it may be a minute. So we're running parts in minutes, complete versus several hours previously.
Fantastic time savings there. Really helps you turn these around quickly, particularly
Absolutely.
for some of the additive parts that could be a little bit more on the prototype side sometimes, or those lower volumes where speed is really important to the customer because they're trying to get something quickly so they can work on it. I could imagine that this is a big benefit for your customer base.
Yeah, I think it's definitely helped our win rate, being able to turn quotes so quickly.
Great. So I think that's a perfect transition into talking a little bit about your key results here and what you've been able to achieve with aPriori. And we've talked to some of these as we've gone through, but maybe could you talk a little bit more about your overall time to quote just throughout HARBEC and what you've been able to achieve there?
I would say in general, we've gone from weeks to days. As we mentioned, additive is really quick now. Molding, it still does take a more of a seasoned, trained person to be able to develop the mold quotes. There's still, you need to select the variables, right? So you need to know the variables you're selecting. So that, but it's still days instead of weeks. So it's considerably faster, exponentially faster. Another big thing is the decreased risk for us. So being that we kind of work in a lot of different realms where there's high quality, all of our ISO certifications all have risk mitigation. It's a big part of ISO. We're able to decrease the risk substantially right in the quoting phase. By having all of our machines in there, it eliminates a ton of manual work that would have had to been done previously. And as a side note, Matt, I haven't even mentioned this to you. We just had an ISO audit, and they noted that as one of the strengths of our company now, is that aPriori is a risk management tool on the front end for quoting.
Holy moly. That's cool.
That's a new one. I haven't mentioned that one yet. But then reduce variability between estimators. We have consistency now. We don't have that variability. It's not there. It's mostly not possible, to be honest. If we're quoting if the customer request comes in as a steel mold with hardened cavities and the cavitation is this, every estimator in the building is going to enter that information and they're going to have the same number.
That's fantastic. And right as well in aPriori, I know you can go take a look at some of the overrides that people have made. So if you want to look backwards and show really quickly, hey, this estimator went through, ran this part and made these assumptions, you don't have to go digging very far. You can just say, okay, let me take a look at these selections and go, oh, that's why this costs the way it does, because they selected this mold material and this action material, and the cavitation is higher than we thought. And then it should all make that really easy to figure out how you got to the number.
Yeah, and it's all retained in the database. So we have every quote that we've ever done in the aPriori database. So we can search that really easily and pull that back up and see exactly what was quoted, how it was quoted, and who quoted it.
Definitely sounds like a huge benefit there. And then you've talked about the number of quoting users. Have you seen that kind of across your commodities, that you've got an increase across the board as to people who can go in and quote now?
For sure, yeah. So, and we're continually training new folks too. The big thing is it doesn't require all of the knowledge that it previously did. So before we were somewhat limiting to our engineering folks, right? Because there's all these calculations and you have to understand how this works and this works and this works. With a lot of that out of the equation, it gets a lot easier to quote. You're not doing all those equations. You're not doing all of trying to figure out exactly how the part will fit, where it will fit, quoting all the individual pieces. You can quote it as a whole, and it's okay. I want this material. I want this kind of mold. And aPriori is kind of generating that, looking at all the different risks analysis and just kind of verifying that, hey, you can do this in-house, or you can't do this in-house. And it's a huge part of quoting, right? Is having the ability to actually make the part.
Absolutely. I know what that cost is going to look like, or even what the
Right,
capacity is going to take up, right? If you've got a high volume machining part that's going to eat up a lot of time on a couple of the mills, that's good information to have as you're going in and having that visibility to, hey, we can make this part, but it's taking up this kind of capacity, and that maybe we need to consider that as you go in.
right.
Could you talk a little bit maybe to how you've been able to use aPriori to communicate a little bit more clearly with the customer about where their costs are coming from and kind of the tools that are available there?
Sure. So we have a couple of reports that we can send out to our customers. And as you can see in the slide here, it will break down the cost by category. So you can send that to your customer. If it's a material heavy part, it's a real easy explanation why the part costs so much money.
Absolutely.
It's like if as this example is, it's 76% material. So it's a good way when you have customers that are very cost conscious to show them that it's 76.6% material. So there's a real limited amount that we have in there for manufacturing costs that we can actually move. Whereas if you're at a lower material percentage, obviously there's more you can move because there's more manufacturing costs involved in that.
Sure.
So it's a really good way to give a customer an estimate or to give them an explanation on the manufacturing process and where all those costs are derived from. So we use that a lot to show customers kind of where they're at and what's possible.
Great. So I want to talk about a little bit different benefit you've been able to get out of aPriori. And so we've talked about your time to quote and reduction in variability, the increase in users, all of those pieces. Walk me through a little bit, if you would, when aPriori was first implemented at HARBEC, what the workflow looked like and how that connected to your ERP system, aPriori.
Yeah. So initially, when we first implemented aPriori, we had viewed it as a piece of software that would run outside of our ERP system. So it would be independent. The results would be in aPriori, and then we'd have to manually enter those into our ERP system, which was okay because we were manually entering the data at that point anyway.
Sure.
And this was just initially, it was viewed as a piece of software that will give us those numbers quicker that we can then enter those into our ERP system. So we would start a quote in our Epicor, which is our ERP system. We would then cost the part and get all of the data in aPriori. Then that same person would manually enter all of that data into our ERP system. We would build out all of the secondary processes, all of the requirements of it, put all those operations in, and then finalize the quote with final cost. So it's a pretty manual process overall. But for us, it was a great jump because we were able to quote things still much, much quicker. But we just had the manual data that we had always had. We still had to enter that data.
Sure. And just to make it clear for everybody that's listening here, you're doing that for every part that you're quoting. Because I know, right, there are some shops that are just dropping things in ERP if they win the business, so you're not losing that time, so to speak. But let's say, you take your win rate and look at the parts you're winning versus the parts you're not. That arguably could be a lot of lost time there for the parts you're not winning because you're managing quotes in ERP.
Right. Yeah. Every single part that we quoted, win, lose, or draw, was entered the same way, just so that we had full record of everything. And all the costing was done the same.
Sure. So would you say that this process, because someone listening to this here could think, oh, it's just a little bit of manual data entry, but based on what you've told me, was this ERP data entry actually a barrier to training users on how to quote? Was this causing problems in the who could quote parts?
Right. So to be able to do a quote, you would have to have knowledge of the ERP system. And anyone who's used Epicor knows that it's a great system, but it's quirky, as any ERP system is. So you would have to have experience with it. You'd have to have a really good understanding of how things flow in it as far as materials and operations and how you built your quote and the hierarchy of the quote. So it wasn't, without that knowledge, you still were not able to enter the quote. So previously, we always had folks that were trained in doing the manual quoting method, and then they were also trained in the ERP system. Once we got aPriori, we realized, okay, so now we can kind of move these quotes through a little quicker, but we still had the barrier of the ERP system and getting everyone trained and up to speed on that.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about what this workflow looks like now. How was this problem solved? If you're quoting a part at HARBEC today, what does this workflow look like?
So we, smart guy over at aPriori came up with an idea to kind of integrate the two systems. So now we enter the only manual part is we enter the initial quote information into aPriori. So it's real easy, part number, part name, the process. That's it. And it's a couple entry fields and a drop down box. And then the quote is saved. And it's just kind of left there in our ERP system.
Yep.
Then you go to aPriori, you bring the same part up, you type in a couple of fields from a quote number and a part name or part number. You do your costing in aPriori. And once that costing is complete, there's a export to CSV that automatically kicks out all of your numbers, all of your information, and it automatically imports that into the quote that you had started. So the data entry is considerably less. It's a couple of numbers and a part name. So
Amazing.
You're not entering all of the operations, you're not entering the materials. We're able to integrate all of that data that comes out of aPriori into our ERP system to automatically generate the quote. And what that did for us, the big part that it did for us is it allowed us to have folks that have expertise in a given area, like let's say additive, but they had never learned the ERP system. But they had the ability now because of aPriori, they could do the quoting because they have the additive background and the expertise in that process. And aPriori allows them just to generate the numbers based on their knowledge. But they don't have to have the expertise in aPriori now. So they can click out of aPriori, it automatically generates the quote for them. And they're able to quote really quickly. It's a significant time savings. I see here, we have it at 15 minutes and it's all of 15 minutes, depending on the quote size. And some larger quotes, it's considerably more than that. And the big thing for us was being able to get more folks here looking to quote.
Sure.
So it was definitely a barrier, and all of the data entry is always a barrier in anything. I think it's one of the toughest things to get people to do is no one wants to enter data.
No one wants to sit there typing in numbers.
And this eliminated it. It's 2 clicks. It's 2 clicks. It's done. Generate your quote, and you're good to go. So I think that was a huge part of the adoption process for aPriori. We were able to get everybody on board a lot quicker to learn the system, just because they knew if they learned aPriori, they didn't have to do the manual entry into aPriori. So it was a win-win for sure.
It's a great motivator there. And I know that, right, that can be a challenge whenever you set up a new software program is just, natural pushback in the organization.
Right.
Even if your organization is really open to new tools and new processes, new things are challenging sometimes to get everybody on board. So it sounds like this helped because it was benefit even above and beyond just using aPriori and the time savings you were getting there.
Yeah, we had a number of people here that wanted to learn aPriori just so they didn't have to do the data entry.
Amazing.
So it worked out really well.
Perfect. So I think that's a nice transition here into some of the future plans. So can you talk a little bit about what's next and how you're looking to continue to leverage all of that data and information that aPriori is generating for all of these quotes?
Right. So aPriori has a pretty good reporting process that you can write custom reports out of. So we've done a few now for mold kickoffs that works really well. But the future plans are to really implement that into every kickoff and to every part in the building. So what we want to do is we want to share all of the data right from the inception to the purchase order to the folks that are making these parts on the floor. And that's possible with aPriori because you have all of the data when you quote, you have everything. So we can look at all the different operations, what machines were used, what orientation it was machined in, what orientation the mold was in. And we can look at all of that, print it out on a custom report, and have those in our job folders for everybody to look at. So they can see, we're going to have, this was quoted with 4 operations, and each operation should take this long. these are the setup hours that were anticipated. These are the material costs that were anticipated. And the idea is that everyone in production can look at that and understand where they're at on the job versus kind of going in blindly. They'll know like, okay, this is quoted here. Oh, wow. So I need to do it this way. And this is the time that I need to at least get this or do a little bit better. And it will also let us see if we have any gaps by doing that too. You know, if we see things are taking a little longer, or maybe things are going considerably faster on one of our mills, we can make adjustments in aPriori. So we can go into aPriori and adjust the throughput of that machine, or adjust the spindle speed or the max feed, or, you know, there's a number of different tools and levers that we can pull to get down to, you know, our goal, like I said in the beginning, it's single percentage points for quote to actual. And it's a tough thing to do in manufacturing with all the processes that we have, but this is the tool that, you know, we've chosen to make that happen.
That all sounds great, right? You're able to get benefit and attack it from a couple different directions, not only setting up the production guys to know how it was quoted, what you're thinking about, and get them started a little bit on how they could go about approaching some of these problems, but also take their feedback, take their knowledge and experience. So if they start poking and going, okay, I'm taking a look at this, but we always do this faster, let's go build that back into aPriori. And having that communication open both ways, I think is really valuable going forward.
Yeah. And like I said, we're looking for single digits. So even small little tweaks are substantial for us to get there. So we're really good now, but we're always trying to continuously improve.
Always trying to get better.
That's it.
So to wrap this up a little bit, let's talk about your keys to success, the things that made you successful going through implementation and then sustaining the use and the value of the software. Could you talk to some of these items that you feel really made HARBEC successful?
Yeah, I think the number one thing was having a team that was engaged and really willing to dive into the software because it is a robust piece of software. There's definitely a lot there. I think it's very intuitive, but there's a lot to learn.
Yeah.
So if you go into it blindly, I don't think you get quite the benefits you would if you really just jumped in and get into the cost model. I suggest everybody gets in there and actually works with their team at aPriori and understands how costs are derived, what drives what variables make a difference. Because once you know all of those, it gets a whole lot easier to implement, as we did. We implemented additive by ourselves just because aPriori trained us so well on the cost model. But even making small tweaks, if you understand where those costs are derived from, it makes everything so much easier just to go back in and make a small tweak. You know, and I think those small tweaks really do make a difference.
Absolutely.
You know, and sometimes it's just it's different and more difficult to convey that back to the team at aPriori too. If you know, I just want to tweak this just a little bit, but only when we're machining this type of material.
Yep.
Whereas if you could just go in yourself and make a quick little adjustment, it's and then see the results and do the testing too. So I think having that engaged team right on the front end that's going to jump in and be in there for the long haul, it's really critical to the software working well.
Absolutely.
And we had a great team, I think, here. We had a great team at aPriori. So we didn't have any issues with our implementation. It went super well. And as I mentioned, I feel like our team knows all of the details of how things are being derived. So it's, you know, there's no questions here. We don't have questions on how we're getting the numbers. Everybody understands. And then if you don't understand, one of the best things that I have, and I used it a lot when we implemented additive, was documentation. So we have aPriori provided us just a huge amount of data and documentation on our custom system. So it's not general resources or general documentation. It's documentation that's related to the individual calculations that HARBEC is using. So we're able to review that. It's searchable. It's a PDF. It's fantastic. I use it all the time, especially when I'm trying to figure out something new. And I'm not quite sure what the calculation was or all the variables that are used to generate that cost. You know, and I think all of that kind of just comes together and allows you to, you know, configure it to what you need.
Absolutely. And to wrap up, I think with maybe an anecdote that shows some of these things, there's you were talking a little bit about during the initial implementation at one point, looking at some of the like a 3-axis lathe and running through those calculations and seeing how that was working, understanding the model, and seeing some results that showed, oh, the machining, it takes a lot longer on this lathe because of the low spindle speed and the live tooling. And there being some questions about, well, does that make sense? And then going back to the manufacturing guys and going, yeah, this is perfect. This is exactly what we want to see. This spindle speed is lower. It does take longer to machine here. So, right, being able to take advantage of what's there in aPriori, see why are these things happening, look at the results, analyze the results, go and connect that to the real world, and just checking off, yeah, that makes sense. That's mechanistic. That fits with how our business runs. I think those kind of things where the team is in there, they're in to understand and know what's going on. Once they understand, then tweaks can be made, but understanding
Right.
is half the battle.
Yeah, yeah. Understanding, I think, was that was the big hurdle we had in the beginning. It's just kind of learning the system. But once we did, as I mentioned, it's super intuitive. It's not difficult. I think it may be overwhelming in the beginning,
Sure.
but it's a very intuitive system. So it's once you learn it, you'd be amazed at the stuff you can do.
Great. Well, Keith, I want to thank you so much for your time and for walking through this. And for everyone on the phone, thank you for attending the session. I want to say, don't forget, if you are a customer of aPriori, if you want to go write a review of aPriori on any of the leading software review sites, including G2, Capterra, or Trust Radius, there's actually a contest going on throughout Cost Insight, and there are a couple prizes you can win. I think there's AirPods running around, depending on how many reviews you write. So keep that in mind as you're going through. We'd really appreciate it. Again, thank you, Keith. As you can see here, we have Keith in my email. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you all and have a great day.